second part of our presentation is from Loyola University and of Maryland. Loyola University of Maryland is committed to educational and spiritual traditions and the development of the whole person. Accordingly, the university inspires students to learn, lead, and serve in a diverse and changing world. And our presenter is Irene Bell. Irene, are you on screen? Are you
I
ready?
am. Are you ready?
Yes, please. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to hear about what you're doing at Loyola.
Yes, thank you for having me. And I was set up so nicely by Digital Promise, which was awesome. So
Yes.
today, I'm gonna just showcase the KA computational thinking micro-credentials that we developed last year, and really dive into the pre-service teachers skill and lesson development. So I'm going to give you some information to start. So we had an opportunity at Loyola in the educational technology program, which is a graduate program for in-service teachers. We developed the micro-credentials for professional learning in 2017 and launched in 2018. And in 2019, we applied for a grant with MCCE to develop computational thinking for pre-service teachers, and we were able to include some in-service teachers within the participants. And so Digital Promise did a really nice job showcasing, Kelly showcased what micro-credentials are. And so we have a very similar definition, which is excellent because it's always updating and being redefined in the literature. But we define it and are using competency-based learning, applying the learning, the acquired knowledge, and receiving feedback. And so our micro-credentials look slightly different than Digital Promise in a couple of different ways, and I'll highlight as we go through how ours are similar and different. So the micro-credentials that we offer, ours are facilitated where there are facilitators walking alongside the participant the entire time of the learning. So because of that, we offer them in sessions, 3 sessions per year, really thinking through not just putting a participant in the learning and then eventually they get it to put their portfolio together and then get feedback, but they get feedback along the way. So at the end, they've been refining their work and their understanding, and any misconceptions, the facilitator is able to support them through those. But within that structure, they are self-paced and completely online and asynchronous. And so we have, there aren't regular dates like weekly dates. We have a start date and an end date. The end date is the only date that they really have to submit everything to. And so the facilitator works with each participant to create a personalized schedule of how they can complete the work in the time allotted. And we usually give anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks to complete the work. So in this, we designed these in spring of 2020 and we launched them in summer of 2020. So just this past summer during the COVID pandemic, which we're still in. So just to talk quickly about the participants who we designed for, we included pre-service Loyola students. So these were students who were either an undergrad or a Master's of Arts in Teaching that have not taught yet. And then we also included in-service Loyola alumni. So these were from the School of Education, undergrad and graduate alumni, as well as we partnered with Baltimore City Public School Systems. And so we had a total of 82 educators go through this past summer into the fall. And we had a really good breakdown of the grade levels. We designed them for K-8. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of those design decisions because of this K-8 focus. We also had a lot of different subject areas represented. And so we'll also talk about how we accounted for the different subject areas and the different 8 grade ranges, as well as the different knowledge that was coming into these micro-credentials to make them applicable for this diverse range of participants. So we developed 3 courses, 3 micro-credential courses that were stacked. And so the participants went through each one, kind of segmenting the information among these 3. The total time was 45 hours. So when we create our micro-credentials, we have to think of seat time because the State Department in Maryland thinks in seat time. And so although they are competency-based, we also try to estimate how much time these take so that we can align them with the continuing professional development credits that educators can get, because we always apply for those. And so, as I was saying before, they are asynchronous and self-paced. So there are no required meeting times or synchronous or face-to-face items, but they are self-paced. So you can do the work on your schedule, and the facilitator helps the participants figure out what that schedule looks like. So the first course was really focused on computational thinking basics. And when we started designing this, we did look at the Digital Promise micro-credentials for computational thinking, as well as some other programs out there. And what we found was that they were really focused on these CT basics, which was really good, kind of pulling apart the information, what is computational thinking. And so with our first course, we started here really thinking through like ensuring that there was the foundation of computational thinking, being able to do basic coding, being able to understand the difference between unplugged and digital and all the different components that are encompassed in computational thinking. But within that, we also had to think through providing choice, so that the teachers and the pre-service and in-service educators were coming in, were able to choose what's most applicable for their classroom or future classroom, as well as for their grade level. So we all know K2 looks very different than 6-8. So making sure that we had a range of resources available for the range of learners that were coming in as our participants. Our second course went more into the pedagogical focus of integrating computational thinking into the classroom. And this is where, in our market research of what was being offered out there, we found that this was not as focused on, and the different pedagogies of actually, okay, I can do computational thinking and I understand it. Now I have to teach my students how to do it. And what pedagogical practices do I as a teacher need for my students to be able to do this? And what do I need to consider? And how do I support them in resiliency? And how do I support them in these like active hands-on constructivism spaces? Like, what does that look like in a classroom? And then what does that look like in a classroom with computational thinking included? And so within this course, we again focused on, we brought in a lot of classroom examples, but also had to bring in choice, a lot of choice regarding the grade level, the content area, really making sure that the course itself, the content could be personalized depending on where you were or where our participants were in both their teaching as well as the content and grade level. And then our third micro-credential was the integration of the two, really looking at, okay, we have the basics of computational thinking and we have the basics of the pedagogical skills that are needed. Now let's put those together and look at what this really looks like in the classroom. And we had the participants do lesson planning. So one of the things that's different from our program from Digital Promise is we don't have the participants submit student created work. Instead, we have them submit work for them. And that's based on a couple of different things. First, we're working with pre-service teachers. So not just being able to develop their skills as learners, but also being able to develop their skills as future teachers in planning for these events or for these integration. But then also, because we run things through the summer, teachers don't always have access to their students. And so we don't want to limit their completion by when they have access to students. We also have to be aware of FERPA and student confidentiality and things like that. So we also look at it through that lens. And so we really focus on their skills of being able to plan for it and do the work within our competency base, as opposed to then putting it into the classroom, because sometimes the first couple times you do it in the classroom, it's not perfect. So, or not, will never hopefully be perfect, but it won't, we understand that's an iterative process. And so then we have other micro-credentials that sit outside of computational thinking that help through that piece of like how to refine lessons and how to like continue if it didn't work, what do you do, especially focused on ed tech. So within all of our micro-credential, all three courses, we really focus on three main objectives: reflect, analyze, and develop. Really making sure that throughout all of the modules and all of the work within these 45 hours that these students reflect, analyze, and develop. And the reason we chose 45 hours beyond just the State Department, professional development recognition, was part of the grant required at least 30 hours. So we were working within this frame of like, how much time should we really have? And what does that look like? Understanding that 45 hours is a lot of time, but we really want to make sure we have a really good foundational knowledge. So I'm going to showcase some of the learning activities that we did. We did design this. This started before COVID happened, or like the shift to remote happened. And we were already planning on doing this fully online. So that shift did not impact us too much, but we did have to think through, how do we do some of these activities, especially the hands-on activities, in an online space? How do we have the teachers think through translating the activities that they're doing into their classroom, both in an online space and a face-to-face space? With schools returning in the fall remotely, a lot of our activities were implemented in the remote space because we presented them in a remote space. But we also wanted to think through, when we're back and we're face-to-face, how do you facilitate these activities and really support the learners in that? So you'll see we had to really think through that. We also had to think through self-paced. So self-paced does not means that if we have a discussion forum and you have to respond to people, if I'm ready for people to respond and no one else is there because they're taking their time to go through it, I'm in a waiting mode. So how do we also support that, have them support each other within this self-paced space of learning, while also ensuring that they're not just in a waiting for other people to come through. So the first thing we did throughout all of the modules and all of the courses is we had a reflection journal where they could really reflect on their new learning, how they would apply that learning back into the classroom, and then what they still didn't know. And so our facilitators, we hired facilitators who we train, and they're K-8 teachers who integrate computational thinking. So they had to send a mini portfolio to us to showcase how they do it when we were hiring them. They walk alongside the participant, as I said. So as the participant is progressing, the facilitator is leaving notes through comments in this reflection journal. So identifying misconceptions, answering questions, and providing resources for these concepts that are still unknown for the of the participants. So looking at some of the, just in course one, some of the things that we did, the computational thinking, we employed a paper airplane activity, thinking through, we're in an online space, but we're also want to showcase unplugged and face-to-face activities that the participants could do. And we did provide a lot of choice. This was one of the activities that everyone had to do, really focusing on the 4 core practices of computational thinking. And so our participants flew paper airplanes and then had to reflect. And I'm going to share, I always have to, okay, I think I did it correctly. Okay, I updated to share sound. I always forget to click the buttons. So we used Flipgrid to do this. So the participants had to fly their paper airplanes and use Flipgrid. Our participants, our facilitators, these are some of our pre-service teachers. Our facilitators then left comments and helped them. And so I'm going to showcase number 8.
So for my airplane model, my version of best was to.
Hold on, she's going really fast because I listen to all my students really fast. Okay, can you hear it? Could you hear the sound? Okay, I see.
So for my airplane model, my version of best was to have my airplane fly in a straight line or have aimability, is what the word I kept using. And so the qualities that I looked for were using a paper that would hold together well and remain folded and create strong folds. And physical features that I tried to put into my airplane were that they had a strong pointed tip for aerodynamics and that the wings were sturdy and held in place. And so I'm going to flip this around so we can watch it fly. So here was my setup. I had a measuring tape out, and then I would line up right above it and fly it. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So I figured that most of my issues with flying were with the wind that happened today, and that after a few tries that the point got a little bit crumpled. So in the future, I think I would use paper that would not get crumpled as quickly, and maybe staple or tape the base together so that it wouldn't come apart like it did at the very end. It started to.
All right. So let's see how I get back. Okay, so we had our participants, hold on, I have to, there we go. So we had our participants do this activity, and we'll talk about kind of what what they liked and what they didn't like. But this was one of the introductory activities, exploring just like what computational thinking is, and the iterative design aspects of computational thinking. And so they had a worksheet that kind of helped them prompt through, ask them questions that then they had to respond within the Flipgrid. So thinking through as well how we do this in an online space, that's also them doing that hands-on piece, applying some of the CT principles. So again, we had more unplugged coding. So really showcasing that you don't need computers for computational thinking or for coding. When we're working with educators around the state and K-8 with various, access to technology, we have to be mindful that not all of them are going to be one-to-one. Even in this remote learning space, not every student was provided a device to go home with. So we want to think about, what kind of devices and what provide options, so that the teachers don't feel like that they are pigeonholed into only doing it when they have access to the computers, but that they can do these things outside of that. And so again, thinking through our participants as well, we made sure anything we showcase, we really tried to showcase vetted websites. We had a computer science and a K-8 teacher as part of our design team, designing these learning opportunities with us. And we looked at, they vetted all the resources that we brought in, but they also we tried to identify things that included age or grade level, as well as content integration. So that, especially for the pre-service teacher who may not know the content as well, may not know the grade levels, may not even know what grade levels they're entering into if they're doing a K-5 range or K-2 or 3-5 certificate. We want to think about, providing them an access to vetted resources that they can quickly pull in once they get into the classroom, without having to really analyze it for developmental appropriateness, content appropriateness, or age. So we did the same thing with coding. One of the limitations we had within the coding is there's not a lot of information, or at least we couldn't find a lot of information on developmental appropriateness for pre-readers in digital coding. And so we were starting to create a lot of our own items, kind of based on our experiences and the research on what you should be, what kind of things you should be using for pre-readers and early readers in digital coding, especially when we start getting into the language that's starting to be used, and starting to really frame that for the teachers. Again, because it's not a lot's out there, they get into a platform, and especially like with code.org, you get into the early reader arrow things and quickly progress into worded items. So really having them think through what is appropriate for where they are or where they're planning on going. And then still focusing on starting to introduce these pedagogical pieces of resilience and perseverance, and having them experience the resilience and perseverance in the things that they're doing. So we used reflection activities to showcase, for them to pull it apart. So they had to try the activities themselves, and then they had to reflect on them. And so one thing that we found was that in pulling apart this information, and this is for the unplugged coding activity, is that, like they could say it's okay if they're not successful. So they're talking about, this was pre-service, that they were struggling with focusing too much on specific cards and suits, not able to develop the strategy. So the facilitator would come in, and we worked with the facilitators to read these prompts and then work with that pre-service and in-service teacher on, so if you struggled in developing the strategy, what kind of things will your students need support with in doing this activity? And how can you create the classroom environment, as well as set up this activity where you won't have a meltdown because of the resilience that's needed, but you can kind of almost scaffold that gradual release of responsibility if needed with your learners. And so we had the participant, or the facilitators, we kind of helped them go through this so that they could provide this feedback along the way, growing those in-service and pre-service teachers. Another activity we had them do, and I'm watching time, another activity we had them do was analyze lessons. And so not just throwing them in the deep end, or just having them do the activities and, okay, now you know what it is, but looking at how computational thinking can be included in the curriculum. So we really wanted to move beyond stop and code, or stop and add this into your class to how can you integrate it into already created lessons? How can you integrate it into the practices that you're doing every day and the content and curriculum that you have? Back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, it used to be hour of code and everyone would stop an hour of code. As a music teacher at the time, a K-5 music teacher, I was asked to do this, to stop an hour of code in my classroom. I saw my students 45 minutes once a week, and I realized I was losing a week of learning or access to my students by stopping and coding. Especially in December, it was concert season. So we had a concert coming up, and I don't have time to just not work on the concert material for a week with my students. So I started thinking about how can I introduce or include hour of code within what we're doing with our concert prep materials so that I'm not losing that time. I'm focusing on what I need to focus on within the content, but I'm also supporting coding, computational thinking and coding and computer science within that work. And so that's what we were trying to pull together with analyzing lessons. So again, we found platforms and had them vetted by our computer science and K-8 specialists within the design team to really provide good lessons that had a good range of selection. So the participants could choose what's most applicable for them, as well as the content, and then look and see how are lessons being developed and being showcased with computational thinking that are not just computational thinking lessons, but they are integrated lessons with content and curriculum. So what we had our participants do was select one of these lessons. And so this was a 3rd through 5th grade lesson that was selected. For each of the core practices for computational thinking, they had to pull an example from the lesson, and we just told them just to copy and paste it straight from the lesson that aligned with the core practices. And then they had to justify that why they thought that this example fit within that core practice and how they saw it. And so then again, we worked with the facilitators in helping the facilitators pull this apart a little bit to support the participants. So then the facilitators were able to look at the justification, the example from the lesson, and the alignment to the core practice, and understand, help the participant if there was any still misconceptions or misalignment, or, depending on what they needed. And so we were helping the facilitators do this to support the participants through the process of this whole learning. And so the last big thing we had them do was develop an original lesson. And we used the understanding by design. So again, we had competencies throughout this whole thing. So for everything they did, there was a certain level of competency they were expected to meet. And we used I can't remember the name. It's okay. We use an 80% met rate. And so it doesn't have to be at 100% perfect, but we do expect it to be 80% or above. Our quality matters. We use the Quality Matters rubric, which is an 80 to 85% met rate for competency. And so the participants had to create a lesson plan, and then they had to analyze their lesson plan for computational thinking connections, really taking it to the next step of, instead of just finding a lesson plan and thinking about how the computational thinking is included in that lesson plan and how that could be brought to your classroom. Now let's look at content that you will specifically be teaching, or a lesson you've already taught, and what are you already doing? So we really wanted to focus not just on adding more stuff to a lesson, but also identifying what practices are you already doing that you may not understand or know that are computational thinking. So are you having your students decompose things? Are you using abstraction? You might not be calling it those words, but you might be following those practices. So kind of pulling apart what they're already doing or what they're planning on doing, and developing a lesson that's has a more purposeful CT integration. So within this is one of the, this is a K2 Life Under the Sea example that they had to say exactly what the students will be able to do, these objectives, and then they planned the whole lesson. Then they had to tell us exactly, very similar to the analysis, what they were doing, how it aligns to the core CT practices, and then a justification with that. So very similar to the analysis, but it was just in this larger lesson plan so they could start thinking through what pieces were going to happen. I see that. And so I'm going to skip ahead. We had a couple of interesting findings. Wrap this up in 1 minute. So much information to showcase, but I really want to showcase the design. So we evaluated our participants. Most of them felt the lowest rating we had on what they thought they could do at the end was a 5.3 out of 6-point scale, So they felt at the end that they could do a lot of things. They could integrate, they could analyze, understand the difference and the resilience. But what we found really interesting was when we actually had them do it within the pedagogical pieces. This is our post-test. We did a pre-post test. We had a lot of the participants correctly identify and correctly apply these practices, but within computational thinking, we were still very low on correctly identifying and applying. So we're looking at now the CT practices that we have and maybe a deeper connection in actually doing these practices, as well as continuing the alignment into the pedagogical practices, which we feel are very important. And so from the pre-service teachers themselves, we learned that more support with formative and summative assessments, the testing and refining of computational artifacts, developing and using abstraction and transferring into practice are still needed, which are not big wows for anyone, but it was really nice to see this. So now we are working with our pre-service, our teacher ed side to continue this work in developing the pre-service teachers. And so that's it. I'll put my information. I'm also, Dr. Kelly King could not make it today, but she's also part of this project. Okay, sorry, I onboarded a lot at the very end. I'll put my stuff in the chat as well.
Thank you, Irene. And for those of you that are still joining us, if anyone still has questions for either of our groups, either Digital Promise or Irene from Loyola, please put your questions either in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask. Wonderful presentations. I'm excited about micro-credentialing, and I'm going to take the information back to my district about working with Digital Promise to get some things started. So if anyone has any questions.
I should thank Renee. Renee was the one that turned us on to the grant. She told me about it. It was due 2 weeks later, and I was like, we're going to do it.
You've done a great job too. Love it.
Irene, can you, when you're from your findings slide, I know you were running out of time, so I just want to clarify. So it looked like the students was it that they learned or successfully used those pedagogies in their lesson plans, but they're still working on the CT concepts? Is that, I want to make sure I'm interpreting that slide right.
So we did a pre-post test. And so in the pre-post test, we developed it with SME, with subject matter expert feedback. And we had just identification questions like multiple choice and true false, where it was like, is this how you define things? We also had applications. So we had scenarios in which we asked specifically, like, what part of this is abstraction? What part of this scenario is decomposition? And what we found was in both the identification of the definitions and the application within these post test at the post test side, the pedagogical pieces were they had an 80% complete like correctness rate, but at the computational side it was very low. And so because we had those vetted and we were using examples that were also used within literature that were reliable and valid, we're looking at our courses to make sure that we are pulling apart that information enough for the participants, because at the end they were not correctly identifying it at a high rate. Like the highest was 20%. So we want to make sure that those we didn't move so far into pedagogy that we lost the computational thinking pieces, especially in the different elements of computational thinking.
Awesome. Yeah, I was just wondering if you guys had thought about like kind of the why behind Airset, because in a previous project I worked on, we found that if you just teach the CT, then they can't do the integration, and it looks like they can do the like pedagogical part, but then there's as with anything, there's a nice balance to be found. So it's interesting.
Yes, it's the balance. That's what we're working on.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, ladies, I want to thank you all so very, very much. Excited to see which way we're going to go with these things. And I'm sure that Diane will be in contact with all three of you to advance using credentialing for our teachers here in Maryland. So thank
I
you
always find
very
it
Go
I
ahead.
always
I'm
find it,
sorry, Irene.
sorry, Renee. I always find it interesting when talking micro-credentials with others, because the definition, as I said at the beginning, is still being developed. And so it's really interesting to see how people interpret competency-based and what that really means, as well as how facilitators or evaluators are utilized. I think that's really interesting as well, because there's other programs like with Digital Promise where the evaluations at the end. North Carolina has a lot of micro-credentialing going on in their state, and they do an end facilitator, end evaluator model where the participants go through, they do all the work, make the portfolio, and then get evaluated. And we utilize that model as well within some of our micro-credential courses, but then we also have the facilitator walking alongside. And those are the ones that our participants like the most because they're getting feedback along the way. But that does cause for more scheduling and timing and different things that are happening.
More work on the end.
Yeah, and you have to have start end dates because you can't just have someone hanging out forever. Similar to like the portfolio submission, there's certain dates in which they're accepted, or a range of which they're accepted, because you need to coordinate the people behind the rating.
Yeah, I just dropped in the chat that it would be really great to just schedule a follow-up call with you, Irene, because it was really great to learn about some of the findings from your research, and we didn't really dig in there, so we can just kind of chat and learn from each other. I think that would be amazing. And Renee, thank you so much for facilitating.
Oh, you're so very welcome.
Yeah.
Very good to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you as well.
And the findings I showcased were just the pre-service teachers. So we were able to differentiate our findings from in-service and pre-service, as well as our pre-service Loyola teachers, our in-service Loyola alumni, and our Baltimore City partner group. So we were able to further differentiate between the three and see kind of like where each group landed.
Yeah. And I'd love to, I always have a lot of questions. I love to see your survey and all that stuff, because like, can we use that? Yeah. So yeah, so thank you so much. I was so glad that we connected.